Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Fiona Corke. She's an Australian actor, wildlife campaigner, and activist. For 8 years, she's volunteered as vice president for the Australian Society for Kangaroos, raising awareness of the beauty and also the cruel fate of kangaroos slaughtered for damage mitigation by farmers and government departments and the commercial kangaroo industry for their meat and skins. In 2007, Fiona co-founded the Macedon Ranges Wildlife Network, where she lives. The network is actively involved in wildlife rescue, wildlife care, and rehabilitation, and raises awareness of the risks and threats wildlife faces from human interaction and imminent development. So first off, thank you for your work, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Oh, thank you, Derek, and also for the opportunity to be able to talk about what's happening here for wildlife in Australia.
Let's maybe if we enjoy this interview, we can do another interview sometime about wildlife in general in Australia. But for today, let's focus on kangaroos. So can you give a brief sort of natural history of kangaroos? I mean, how many species are there? What are they like? How big? How small? All that stuff.
Okay. There are a number of species of kangaroos, or macropods, as they are called. Many species of macropods have become extinct in Australia since white settlement. But the four main species I'll probably discuss because they're the ones that I know more about, and they are the four species that are targeted by the commercial kangaroo industry, and also the ones that suffer most currently at the fate of humans. It's interesting how we view kangaroos, I guess, because on the one hand, kangaroos are the second most recognised symbol in the world. They're uniquely Australian. They're a national emblem, along with the emu. And also they're described as being important to both the Australian culture and our national image. And on the other hand, they're seen as an inconvenience, and they're hated and demonised and persecuted. And their fate has become, quite well known for being the largest commercial land-based wildlife slaughter in the world, which we will get to talk about later. Kangaroos themselves are such unique animals. The big red is the largest living marsupial on the planet. And then there's the eastern grey and the western grey and the wallaroo. And as I said, they're the ones that are targeted by the industry. Kangaroos in themselves are extremely sociable, and they're really affectionate. They have what's called strong matrilines, which is an incredibly strong bond between all the females of a mob. So it's the mother and daughter, the female siblings, the aunties and grandmothers. Now, this matriline and this strong bond it's very unique. It doesn't happen in a lot of animals, or hasn't been discovered in a lot of animals. But they are dependent on these, absolutely dependent on these bonds for the successful rearing of their young, including social skills. A baby kangaroo is dependent on its mother for 18 months. That's a grey kangaroo. A red kangaroo, Joey, is about 14 months. And even when there's a new sibling in the pouch, the at-foot Joey, which we call an at-foot Joey, which means that the Joey is a little bit older, could be a juvenile. It's too big to fit in the pouch, so you do sometimes see very large Joeys in kangaroo pouches. And the female kangaroo has two teats. She has one teat that supplies the milk for a very small, hairless baby kangaroo, and then another type of milk for what we call the at-foot Joey, or the juvenile. And that juvenile still needs to drink, even though he's not in the pouch. He's dependent. They're dependent on their mum for up to 18 months old. Female kangaroos, younger ones, will stay with their mother if they can for their entire life. Young male kangaroos will make their way to new territory and new mobs to ensure and to keep going a strong genetic diversity amongst kangaroos. And it's unfortunately many of the young males get killed when they're doing this.
So
I guess that's a rough thing, kangaroos. I don't know if there's anything else in their biology or whatever. As everyone knows, kangaroos can jump. They do jump fences. but actually a kangaroo would rather go underneath a fence than over a fence. Most Australians don't even know that. They just think, oh, it's fine, it'll just jump over the fence. But fences actually cause quite a few problems for kangaroos, and where I live locally, many of them do get stuck in fences. They trip on the top wire and then they just flip and they hang. And unfortunately, the joey then will fall out of the pouch and be at risk of predation and starvation. So those kinds of issues for kangaroos and many others, which we'll get to at some point, hopefully in the interview, face them daily.
And so let's talk about kangaroos and generally the state of Australian wildlife prior to conquest by Europeans. Like in the United States, there were 60 million bison, and they were taken down to, at one point, I believe 100. And there were 16 million 26 million pronghorn antelope, and they were taken down to about 12,000. Prairie dogs are about 2% of their traditional range. So what about Australia? I think a lot of people probably might not know a lot about it. And what about kangaroos? Were they extremely common? Were they everywhere? What's the story?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting one because basically these days the general belief is by our culture that there are more kangaroos now than there were when white settlement happened. That we have created more kangaroos because we've put in dams and we've cleared land and and through agriculture we've created paddocks that kangaroos can feed from. But in actual fact, they do not know how many kangaroos were here before white settlement. There are no reports of explorers doing kangaroo counts as they were on their quests to one side of Australia to another. But there are a number of archived excerpts on just what people back then reported seeing kangaroos. And the founder of our organisation, Dr. John Orty, actually studied and researched a lot of these. And he came to the belief that he believes there were many more kangaroos before white settlement, and that now, currently, we probably have about 10% of what was. But that will be argued by authorities, and there's nobody settled in Australia of what actually was the truth. So I think we're living with a lot of fuzzy logic regarding kangaroos. So because of that belief that we have created more of them, then justifies the fact that we can then kill them and use them and utilise their carcasses as a resource.
So, and before we talk about threats to kangaroos, what are some of the roles of kangaroos in a healthy, functioning, natural community? Like prairie dogs create homes for all sorts of other creatures, and they also are food for ferrets and wolves. Bison create wallows that migratory birds will rest in or will feed in. So what do they do?
Okay, well, the kangaroo is absolutely integral and vital to the Australian landscape. The way I view them is I see them as kind of Australia's biggest gardener. I mean, their role is actually the spreading and sowing of native seeds of grasses and shrubs. So what happens is that the kangaroo doesn't chew the seeds. So the seed passes through their body, it comes out cocooned in its own fertilizer that gets pushed in by the toenail of the kangaroo, and the soil swept over by the tail, waiting for the next rain to come when it will grow. So they are incredibly important in keeping this fragile landscape together. We have a lot of areas of Australia, as obviously in America, that are very arid and desert-like. So if we do remove a lot of the macropods from the land, what will happen because of that? I don't know if anybody's thought that far down the track, but these are the things that we actually need to look at, not just how they're affecting farmers, but actually the effect that they have on the landscape. But there has actually not been much research into that, Derrick, which is a big shame.
So Okay, so what are what?
Sorry,
So go ahead.
to finish that, I was just going to say, because they do spread native grasses and shrubs, that then provides food and habitat for a whole ecosystem. They're a part of keeping it all going, and I guess they're the reciprocal arrangement of death of what feeds on them. The thylacine was a big predator of the kangaroo, and now that has disappeared from the landscape. And also we don't have many dingoes left in Australia. The authorities believe and put out there into our culture that kangaroos have no predators, and therefore that's another reason they have become overabundant and need controlling.
But traditionally, the kangaroo populations would have been kept in check by dingoes and what was the other creature?
Dingoes and thylacines, or the Tasmanian devil, which is a kind of a large quoll. So they've totally disappeared off the landscape, they've been shot out.
So what are some of the threats to kangaroos?
Okay, so kangaroos still have threats. They have plenty of predators, and one I mentioned before was fencing. So agriculture has actually brought many threats for kangaroos with it. We also have a large wild dog population here. I don't know if you do in the United States, and they have national programs to try and reduce wild dog numbers. So wild dogs, I would say, have replaced dingoes. And then we have other predators such as man and guns and cars and roads. So there still are predators, yet the authorities keep putting out there that kangaroos don't have any predators. That's what they do every year in Canberra or the Australian Capital Territory. There's an annual cull there every year, which does get a lot of overseas attention, and we've made sure of that over the years. But they trot that line out every year to say the kangaroos have no predators, yet they use 20% of the carcasses for bait for wild dogs. So that's actually saying that there are wild dogs, so that they do have predators. It's an ongoing, ridiculous and ludicrous argument.
So you mentioned earlier that kangaroos are the victims of the largest land-based wildlife slaughter in the world. Considering all the slaughters of wildlife that go on around the world, that's pretty depressing. Can you talk about that slaughter? And you mentioned a specific cull too.
Yes, well, around 90 million kangaroos have been slaughtered in the last 20 years. And basically the industry and the commercial utilisation of kangaroos started in the 60s as a reason to justify the waste, the fact that we shoot the kangaroos because farmers don't like them on their land. So we'll utilise that carcass because otherwise it would be a waste. So now the kangaroo industry uses farmers and landholders. They send shooters to properties who declare that they have a problem with kangaroos. They will also say how many kangaroos they believe they have on their property. They write that down in the application. No government department comes and checks their numbers, and a permit is issued, most oftentimes on the phone. A shooter will go around there and take the kangaroos off their property. The kangaroo industry has brought a lot of attention over the last few decades, and basically the main reason is because of the cruelty, because when a female kangaroo is killed, her baby is ripped from the warmth and safety of the mother's pouch by its hind legs. It is bashed with a crowbar or on the tray of the truck or on the tow bar of the truck or against a rock or a tree, and it is just discarded and left on the ground while the mother is often, sometimes she also may still be alive, hooked up on the back of the truck with a number of other kangaroos and taken to a processing plant. Kangaroos are nocturnal animals, so they are shot at night in the middle of Australia in very remote areas. It's very hard to track. There is no policing or there is no supervision of the shooting, so there is no one there to supervise the killing in the field, and that everything is done correctly and humanely. There was a a government report that came out in 2014 that was to examine the cruelty in the kangaroo industry because it had been its Achilles heel for so many years. And so finally, after 30 years of no research being done on it, they did some research, and the outcome was really quite horrific. The researchers said that they actually couldn't call the killing of joeys euthanasia because euthanasia means a good death, in inverted commas, and they said it is humane as it can be at the moment, but they're not happy with the outcome. They also found that a number of the shooters that they researched and followed didn't actually kill the joeys, which killing the joeys is actually a requirement. It comes under a code of practice. It's a recommendation. It's not a legal document. So they're required by law to do this to the joeys. And in the report, when they followed a number of shooters around, and it also says in the report that a number of the kangaroo meat processing places didn't want their shooters to be involved in this research, and that's very alarming as well. But the ones that they followed, that they found that they didn't kill the joeys as they should have per the code of practice, and in actual fact many of the shooters just let them go. So you've got a young juvenile kangaroo with no mother being left orphan in the landscape, and that joey will be prone to starvation, to predation from foxes. Foxes alone in this country take 50% of joeys, and raptors and eagles, as I mentioned before. And so that joey will basically die a very slow and cruel death. So this was a worry for the researchers because they found it was a very, very common occurrence. So, of course, after that research came out, despite the authors saying that this must be made available to the public, the public must know about this, the report was shelved and buried. We've just spent a lot of time working on it and are trying to get the findings of this report out into the media. And guess what? We're having a lot of trouble doing that as well. It's just the thing sometimes that happens in this country. People don't really want to know the truth about what happens to kangaroos. It's the same with many other animals and things going on in the world. People would rather bury their head in the sand about it and let it go on.
And you've written elsewhere on the website for the Australian Society for Kangaroos, since 2001, kangaroo populations have declined by 40%.
Yeah, before that, the kangaroo populations are taken from the commercial shooting zones where they do aerial surveys by helicopters and planes. They fly over and count kangaroos as they go, which there's a lot of criticism about the way that's done too. So they came, that's where the figures are based on, those commercial shooting zones. So where I am in Victoria, we don't have a commercial industry per se. We have one trying to come in through the back door. So basically, pre-2001, kangaroo populations were considered to be 57.5 million. In 2001, that was in 2001. In 2006, the population crashed to 23.5 million. That's nearly a 65% crash. That's massive. Now, a lot of that was blamed, the drought was blamed for that, but we've had lots of droughts here. Kangaroos have lived through lots of droughts. There must be other reasons for that big decline. But authorities will say it's just because of the drought. But when we have drought here, Derrick, the industry still continues. They still shoot kangaroos because then they say, oh, well, they'll starve to death, so we better shoot them. So they can't really win either way. So they're better off if we shoot them than let them starve. But the fact is the industry doesn't target the weak and the sick kangaroos. The industry targets the biggest and the most healthy for their skins and their meat.
So I know that when elephant social structures, when elephant families, let's just tell it like it is, when elephant families are destroyed through poaching, sometimes the young who then grow up will not be properly socialized and can become really atrocious. There was a case several years ago of some male elephants who were really terrible, and they were raping rhinos to death and doing all sorts of horrible things. And basically, they brought some of the matriarchs in, some of the grandmother elephants, and basically the grandmothers whipped them into shape and 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 rehabilitated the young horrible males. And so you talked earlier about the social structures. So do you know, or is there research done on what happens when you destroy or partially destroy a family social unit?
No, there isn't any research done on that, Derek, and I'm glad you brought that up, because kangaroo mobs and families that are constantly shot at are either constantly being killed or displaced. And when I talked about the bonds that are so vital, they're constantly being broken. When, as I said, that they always target the biggest and the strongest, every mob has an alpha male. So, and that alpha male, it's taken many years for him to get to that position, and he's had to win that through fighting. And once he becomes, when there is an alpha male, the alpha male keeps all the other males in check. So if other males are trying to mate with females, the alpha male will make sure that that doesn't happen, or it will happen. It's all up to him. So when the shooter comes along and they see the big alpha male, they go, oh, there's a big guy, let's get him. Bang, he's dead. You've got the alpha male taken out of the picture. And then what happens, has been noticed quite regularly, is that the young males become absolutely rampant. And in some situations, they can overmate with the females and really hassle and harass them, which becomes difficult for them because they've got no one to stop it and help them anymore, because the alpha male's gone. And now with the industry, because there's been so much talk and highlighting of the cruelty in the industry is now saying that they don't target females, despite the fact that under our own investigations and through FOI information, they killed 260,000 females in the last 2 years. They say that they don't kill them. This is what we're dealing with all the time, Derek, and it happens with many species and many things that are occurring around the world. The real truth isn't getting out there. So the industry's decided that they will do an all-male kill, and they're very proud of the fact that they, won't be killing females anymore, yet they still do. But there is no research on whether an all-male kill is sustainable. There is no research, and that is terrible. So now we're pushing that view, but I don't know when that research will be completed. They're already saying, there's been the last 2 years saying, oh, it's an all-male kill, but still no research on the table.
Living in the United States and growing up in the western United States, I am unfortunately extremely well acquainted with the hatred of wolves and prairie dogs and other species too. But it's like, nobody hates salmon. Salmon can be, they are commercially exploited and they are harmed, but there's not this overwhelming hatred as there are of prairie dogs. It's like, same deal. Nobody hates bluebirds. Bluebirds are okay. Their habitat's destroyed, but with prairie dogs, wolves, and some other species, they are just hated. And before we turned on the recorder, you were mentioning a hatred of kangaroos, and I didn't know, not living in Australia, I don't know anything about this. So are kangaroos hated by many, and especially farmers/ranchers? And if so, let's talk about that hatred.
Yeah, look, they're much loved by many people as well, but it's very divided, and there's a lot of people who hate them. And the main reason that they're hated by farmers is because farmers believe that they compete for grazing, so there's grazing competition issues, despite the fact that 3 kangaroos will eat as much as 1 sheep, 20 kangaroos will eat as much as 1 cow. Many landowners don't even know that. So there's grazing competition and the fact that farmers also say that kangaroos ruin their fences, or when a kangaroo gets caught in a fence, the kangaroo usually will die because the kangaroo's ruined as well. So they say that the kangaroos cause much damage to them and financial loss, yet a landowner or farmer never has to declare that damage or financial loss. So there's some of the main reasons. But while I'm on that, I will also say that there are some landowners who don't kill kangaroos. I spoke to a wheat farmer once who grew 3,000 acres of wheat, and he rang because the dairy farmer next door wanted him to shoot the kangaroos, and he didn't want to shoot them. He didn't believe that to him they didn't cause any damage. He loved and enjoyed them. So really, when I believe that when people are talking about damage, it's a perception. I don't know how much truth there is in it. And that's something I'm exploring constantly. I go and talk to farmers and landowners about kangaroos because I want to know more myself. So we've got that grazing competition and fence damage. The other reason that they get killed for in Canberra and many other places is because they damage the environment and they threaten other species like little lizards and moths and things, which is pretty ridiculous, seeing that most of the places where they say that, they have made no mention of any feral cats or foxes and other species that would do that damage. But they say that kangaroos overgraze and therefore reduce their habitat. We're just going through that now on Swan Island in Victoria. They're killing 165 kangaroos on a Defence Army base because they threatened the orange-bellied parrot. And because there were 40 seen there in 1990 and now there aren't, the kangaroos are to blame. And honestly, Derrick, that's basically how people are viewing it. And a lot of the work we do is trying to bring attention to that because there is no evidence, there is not a scrap of evidence that will support that kangaroos destroy the environment. The study that it came from was when they did research in the 1990s at a place called Hattacolkine in Western Victoria, where they said big reds were destroying the landscape because they were digging holes at the bases of trees and that they would kill the trees, so therefore they needed to kill the kangaroos. Now, many years later, a few years ago, I spoke to one of the scientists involved in that, and I said to him, did he ever think that the kangaroos digging holes at the bases of the trees, there was maybe a reason for that? That maybe they did that so that when it did rain or that when water came across the land, that it will go directly down to the roots, and maybe that was the reason for it. Well, his jaw just dropped open, Derrick. He didn't know what to say. They don't think of things like that. They don't think that that there may be a reason that animal is, or the kangaroo in this case, is doing something. It knows what it's doing. It's the human coming and saying that animal is making a hole there. We don't want a hole there beside that tree. That must be wrong, and so therefore they need to be killed. So they do suffer a lot from being killed for environmental damage because they eat grass, and they put these silly little hoops around reserves, hoop areas off, and then they take the hoop away and they say, look, the grass is longer here than it is outside the hoop. We've proved kangaroos eat grass. And we say, you probably didn't need to use the hoop. We could have told you that. And their whole measuring of biomass, it's all, there's nothing that really supports it. But unfortunately, the untruths and the lies get more attention than the truths, which is often the case. So environmental damage, grazing, then we've got health and safety, because people think that kangaroos might attack you. Sometimes in remote areas, kangaroos will gather close to town in hard times because there might be a bit of pick there or some green grass, so they will move in to reserves and ovals. And so then the councils say, well, they're pooing all over the oval. They've got ticks. The children will get the ticks from the kangaroos, and also then they might attack you, so we need to kill them. So that's another reason. Kangaroos, there have been kangaroo attacks in this country, but no one has actually ever been killed by a kangaroo. And most times kangaroo attacks happen because a dog is involved. A dog to a kangaroo is its major predator, so it will just go in to do what it needs to do. A kangaroo, when it comes across a dog, will often lead that dog to a dam, because that's what they did with dingoes, took the dingo to a dam and where they would drown it. It was their only safety. But unfortunately in that process, if it was a female kangaroo and she had a joey, she would probably lose the joey in the process because it would die in the water. That's their only defence, or running. The only other situation where kangaroo attacks may occur is if a kangaroo is startled or is cornered, or it's become displaced in somebody's yard and they've walked out and startled it. It's just trying to protect itself. And I've spoken to quite a few people who have been in that situation, and they've all said to me, it was my own fault. I shouldn't have done what I did. But unfortunately, they get a lot of attention. They get a lot of media hype every time one of those incidences happen. And also there's roads. A lot of kangaroos are hit on our roads, unfortunately. People drive very fast in rural areas. We don't have adequate signage or informative or instructive signage on the roads that actually tell people what to do when they see a kangaroo. We don't have anything in our learner driver handbooks to teach young people what to do if they see a kangaroo or other wildlife on the road. So people are completely uneducated, and so when people hit them and then people say, oh, there's too many kangaroos, we need to shoot them. And then, well, it's a waste if we don't use the carcasses, so then we should use the carcasses for pet food or for skins for sport shoes and leather products. And so it goes. So they're the main reasons that kangaroos are targeted. But a lot of those, there's a lot of things that people don't understand. There's a lot of misunderstandings in those beliefs, and that's what we try to bring truth and light to.
So I want to go back to early on, and thank you for saying all that. And I want to go back to something you said a little while ago about kangaroos eating grasses, and that could affect that could harm native species. And there's a couple of things. One is, I know in the United States, white-tailed deer populations have exploded because they've killed all the predators. And so in the United States, at least, white-tailed deer do actually harm ground-dwelling birds and so on by eating the brush. But the answer, of course, is to reintroduce predators.
That's right. Yes.
But there's another point I want to get to here, which is how many sheep and cattle are, when we're talking about populations, pre-contact populations, there's something else. How many sheep and cattle are there approximately in Australia?
Oh, there are millions. I actually don't have a figure on it, but there are way more sheep and cattle in this country than there are people. But I don't have an actual figure on that.
So where I'm going with that, of course, is that if kangaroos are the primary herbivore, and there are sheep and cattle who have become one of the primary herbivores in the country, then there's a question of who is actually causing more harm to the to the native grasses.
Well, that's right. Look, I've got an interesting story. I've spoken to a shooter recently, a commercial kangaroo shooter from Cunnamulla in southwest Queensland, and he rang our organisation because he got no help from the authorities, and he's furious because many farmers in that district aren't even letting him on the property as a commercial shooter. They're actually just getting damage mitigation permits and having shooting parties. But he told me an interesting story. He said that many people up in that area now have Dorper sheep. And Dorper sheep are very, they've sort of been introduced here in Australia. Before that, most people had merino sheep. And the Dorper sheep is very hardy, so they think it will be better for the Australian landscape. But he told me something very interesting that I did not know. And he told me, he said, Fiona, the Dorper sheep are eating people out of house and home. He told me that a Dorper sheep eats 4 times as much as a merino sheep or another kind of sheep. And he said the paddocks where the Dorper sheep are bare, there's dirt there. Paddocks where there's other sheep with kangaroos, there's still grass. He but people aren't seeing that the Dorper sheep are eating so much. And not only that, he told me that they were getting out of people's properties and they're going into the bush and they're eating shrubs that birds nest in, and there's birds there that are disappearing from the landscape due to the Dorper sheep. Yet more Dorper sheep will be put in the landscape because they suit the Australian landscape better, but they are eating 4 times as much as other sheep did. So, and that's what he said. And Fiona, the kangaroos are getting blamed for it. It's interesting the white-tailed deer you were talking about, because a lot of studies on kangaroos are based on those American studies on white-tailed deer. They use those studies to prove that kangaroos do the same here.
Well, it seems to me that it would be a better idea to actually use studies on kangaroos to see what happens with kangaroos and use studies on white-tailed deer.
Yeah, but I just want to add to that too, Derek, because there's something interesting that kangaroos do, and I don't know whether white-tailed deer do, and it has been researched, and lots of people have seen it, that when a population is, well, first off, kangaroos in the wild, when there is drought or times are hard, many people may not know this, but a female kangaroo will suspend the embryo and go into what they call diapause. So the embryo will be on hold until times are good and the rains come, and then they will go into breeding. It's incredibly unique. That's what kangaroos have, and they've had to have that to be able to live in this landscape. So what we've noticed in captive populations and where research has been done, that the kangaroos recognise that they only have a certain amount of land. And so they actually reach an equilibrium within that environment, and they reduce their breeding. So any captive population of kangaroos will have very few joeys compared to the wild. But this is not really taken into account, and it's, even though there's been research, good research done, it's poo-pooed, dismissed in the attempt to kill them. It's a very, very important factor. So in mind with them having that and reducing their breeding because they know their environment they live in is sensitive, they have a capacity and ability to be able to do that, which is quite unique and fascinating. Yet, as I say, it's not put on the table. Kangaroos overbreed. Kangaroos are in plague proportions. Kangaroos are always in plague proportions in this country, despite populations crashing by 65%. And it was what Deanna said about the prairie dogs. People still think there's millions of them. We don't need to worry. But if you look at the story of the passenger pigeon, which I know you well know, Derrick, was it that people just shot every passenger pigeon? Was that what made them go extinct? No, it wasn't. I've spoken to some people who work with species extinction, and it's not really known still why species do become extinct. But this guy told me when I was talking to him about the big red kangaroo, because that's probably the one that is in most trouble in this country, that the story with the passenger pigeon, they got shot and they got shot until they obviously got to a certain number. There was a trigger point, and from that trigger point they go into what scientists call ecological depression. And that ecological depression then causes them to die out. And within that ecological depression is things like the numbers were reduced so much that it made the birds, they didn't have the numbers to feel safe, so that made them breed less, and then there's the loss of habitat. It's a number of things, or a chain reaction, that causes an extinction. It's not necessarily the total outright killing. So you need to be very careful with any animal, that if once it's got a dollar sign on its head, and that's the reason it's killed, we need to look to the future and do our research properly. So the thing that kangaroos are in plague proportions is bandied around. I've asked many people, how big's a plague? How many kangaroos are in a plague? Can someone please tell me? And for some people it could be 20, for some people it could be 80, or it could be a couple of hundred. I'll tell you this story. Once somebody told me that they'd seen thousands of kangaroos in this area. I knew the area, and I said, really? Thousands? You saw thousands of kangaroos? And they went, oh, no, maybe hundreds. I said, hundreds? Really? Like, more than 500 or less than 500? I was pretty persistent. And they thought, and they went, probably less than 500. Went, okay, how much less than 500? Less than 200? I got them down to 80, Derrick, and then I thought I better stop.
Okay.
And I'm not kidding. And that's so ingrained in our culture. People say, I saw hundreds of them, but there's only 20 there. And it's just automatic. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So it would still be, even when, if it gets to the time when we have no or very few kangaroos left, which it seems to be heading that way, people will still be saying that there are plagues of kangaroos. They're always referred to by the people who don't like kangaroos as being in plague proportions.
You know, and once again, what we're seeing, even when we do, even if somebody is fortunate enough to see 80 at a time, that I think about this in terms, I live in Redwood Forest, Northern California, and I see bears all the time. I will routinely see, it's a rare day where I don't see at least one mother and her two babies.
Oh,
and that's wonderful until I read that prior to conquest, it would be routine in this area for somebody to see a grizzly bear every 15 minutes. And grizzly bears are gone. These are black bears now. But the point is that I'm just guessing that if somebody can see 80 now, 800 years ago, that would have been 800.
Oh, that's right. And you don't see 80 everywhere. You don't see, a lot of tourists come to this country to see kangaroos, and they don't see them. I travelled from Victoria up to Birdsville, which is in central Queensland. I counted on my first trip 11 live kangaroos I saw, but hundreds of dead ones on the road. And that's I'm talking about a 2,500, 3,000 mile kilometre trip. So they're disappearing off the landscape. And this shooter, who I've been recently talking to, he was really concerned because he said there's not a kangaroo left in our area. He said, I can drive for 500 k's and I won't see another kangaroo. So what happens when times are tough also for kangaroos, that often the mobs will join together. They'll run together, 3 or 4 species. So you're not even just talking about the one type of kangaroo. We're talking about 4 types of kangaroos here. But people just put them all in together and just go, a kangaroo's a kangaroo. So, it's very hard.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's a couple questions. One of them is, the first question is, what is it precisely, if you can say, that made you fall in love specifically with kangaroos as opposed to a type of parrot or it's a mammal. They're really cute as babies, and I've heard they're really foul-tempered when they get to be adults. What are they? It's Australian. Oh shoot, they're big. They're a big mammal. They're herbivores. Who are they?
Not wombats.
Yeah, wombat.
Wombats?
Like why did you fall in love with kangaroos as opposed to wombats? What is it about kangaroos that's so great?
I love them all, Derrick. I really do. But for me, kangaroos are in the most trouble, and I think that's why I became involved in that. When I moved out of the city to where I am now, I heard that they were killing 27,000 grey kangaroos at Puckapunyal Army Base, which was not that far from where I'd moved to. And I was absolutely horrified. 27,000 for no real reason, because they destroyed the environment and they believed there was too many of them. And I think that was when the realisation hit me. I knew that kangaroos were killed, but I never knew to the level that they were killed on. And so that's probably what started me asking questions. And when I rang the RSPCA, which is an authority for the protection of animals in Australia, because I knew that these animals were enclosed by electric fence on this Army defence site, I said, why don't they just open a fence or a gate and let some of the kangaroos out? And there's this dead silence on the other end of the phone. And they said, oh, well, nobody ever thought of that. And I couldn't believe it. I later knew, it was not naive and green then. I later found out that, the Environment Department said, oh, well, if we'd done that, they would have gone onto the farmland and farmers would have wanted then a permit to shoot them. And I said, but you're just assuming that. You don't know that for sure. So I think the fact that so many were killed and the cruelty, it does happen to all our wildlife on some level, but not to the level that happens for kangaroos. And also there's not many people fighting for kangaroos here, Derrick. So that's why I teamed up with a woman called Nikki Sutterby, and together we took up the Australian Society for Kangaroos that was founded, as I said earlier, by Dr. John Orty, who didn't really do much with it. He was a lot older and has since passed away. And he was very glad for Nikki and myself to take it over and do what we could. We're the only organisation the kangaroo organisation in Australia or in the world. Wildlife groups and animal groups include kangaroos in their campaigns, but we are the only kangaroo group, solely fighting for them and for their future.
So I guess now I have two questions. One of them is, so if you were suddenly made queen of all things kangaroo, and you could dictate policy, but the rules are you can't get rid of either capitalism or civilization within the first month.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to go within the current social structure. What would you do regarding kangaroos? I presume you'd stop the hunt.
Look, the commercial industry is on pretty much its last legs anyway, particularly after the ban in California being reinstated, which was a great win for us all last year. It doesn't actually stop the culture that wants to kill kangaroos. It's so ingrained in our culture. That's a very difficult thing to change. But what we do try and do in the process is try to get people to look at non-lethal management of kangaroos. Okay, your perception is that they cause a problem, but can we overcome this problem using non-lethal methods? Why does it have to be lethal? And we've had a few wins with that in captive populations. Instead of killing them, we've pushed for fertility control. There was a reserve where they were going to shoot 50 kangaroos last year. It wasn't that far from the city. There was a big outcry. We kept it going and pushed the government basically into extending the fertility control. So there's plenty of options, and what we want is just people to look at options instead of just killing.
And the next question is, how can somebody help you if they are hearing this program and they either live in Australia or they live in South Dakota or they live in Denmark? In either of those cases or any of those cases, how can they help?
Okay, well, people can help straight away by not buying any kangaroo products. That will include, it could be in pet food, it could be in restaurants, they could be selling kangaroo there, sports shoes and leather goods, iPad covers, all those things can be made from kangaroo skin, so just read the labels carefully and don't buy into that cruelty. The other thing people can do is to go and visit our website, AustralianSocietyForKangaroos.org. We also have a Facebook page that keeps people up to date with our campaigns. And we need the support when we have a campaign on for the support, and letter writing and emailing is really helpful in these situations. And just for people to do whatever they can. If they're in Australia, and we have many people contacting us, you can save your local kangaroos, and we have saved a lot of, managed within communities to help people save their kangaroos. And it can't just be up to one organisation. Everybody has to do what they can, and it's everybody's responsibility. So that would be wonderful if people could take those steps, and that will reduce. And also have the conversation. I think that's another important thing, Derrick. Have the conversation about it, because I think the conversation changes a lot.
Well, thank you so much for your work, and I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Fiona Corke. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.